Welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by RCAT. This is the show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is Andrew Wolfram, AIA, Principal at TEF Design in San Francisco, California. Andrew is a principal at TEF Design and an advocate for building regeneration, urban architecture, and placemaking, and its power to advance responsible development. In his 25 years of practice, he has promoted the value of historically significant sites and their role in providing cultural vitality to our cities and our neighborhoods. He led the transformation of some of the Bay Area's most significant historic landmarks into vibrant and relevant new uses. The project we will be talking about today is the Tapscott Building in Uptown Oakland, California. The Tapscott Building, an elegant Beaux Arts structure in Uptown Oakland, has been brought back to life through a meticulous shell and core restoration. Once deteriorating and abandoned, this historic gem now serves as the cornerstone of an ambitious revitalization plan along a long-neglected stretch of Broadway. Now, let's get into the details. Welcome back to Detailed. My guest today is Andrew Wolfram, AIA, Principal at TEF Design in San Francisco. The project we are talking about today is the Tapscott Building in Uptown Oakland, California. Andrew, welcome to Detailed. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. And I'm so excited to be here. I'm a huge fan of your podcast, so it's really great to be connecting with you.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to know somebody listens. I'm just very flattered by that. Thank you. Let's get right into it. I always start with an icebreaker question just to get us warmed up and find out a little bit about you. So the question you get today is, what is your professional inspiration and why?
I would say, I think my professional inspiration, or at least the architect that most inspires me, is the Italian architect Carlo Scarpa, who practiced in the 50s through the 1970s in Italy. And what he was just a master at was renewing old buildings with just this incredible sensitivity. Sensitivity to the original character of the buildings, but just what he brought to the work he did was just incredible sense of the materials, of creating beautiful textures, the light, the character. Um, one of his most famous buildings is the Castelvecchio Museum in Verona, and it's just every time I go there, it's just I feel like I get really emotional because it's just such a beautiful, beautiful, exquisite place. So I've always been inspired by him and by his work.
That's funny. The first building I ever entered that actually emotionally moved me to tears, which I did not think was possible for a building. And I walked into St. Peter's, and I'm not particularly religious either. I was absolutely moved, just completely overwhelmed and moved in a way that I'd never experienced before. And that moment made me start looking at buildings in a different way.
Yeah.
And start feeling buildings in a different way. So I get it about being emotional now that I remember where I was at. Before we start talking about the Tapscott Building project, there's a whole interesting history here. Give me a little history on this building. What was its first life?
Yeah. The Tapscott Building was built in the 1920s in the Uptown neighborhood in Oakland, which was a thriving down sort of urban district in Oakland, shopping district, lots of stores, department stores there. And it was built as an office building with storefronts, retail storefronts all on the ground floor. And then it also included a large theater. It was designed by the well-known in Oakland architecture firm of Reed and Corlett. And when you look at historic photos of that time, you see the building full of people, this beautiful glazed the whole ground floor was full of these, storefronts, so you could see all the shops, and they had beautiful large awnings. So that was its original history in that period in the 1920s, kind of a thriving building and a thriving downtown district. By the 1970s, things were not looking so good for the Tapscott Building. They did this really terrible renovation in which a lot of the historic detail was either removed or covered up. So there were all these beautiful terracotta details, terracotta cornices and spandrel panels. They clad them in metal panels. They took off all the historic windows and replaced them with these terrible aluminum windows. So really, really not sensitive at all. And then in 1989, in the Loma Prieta earthquake, the building was very badly damaged by the earthquake, and it was deemed unsafe. So at that time, they demolished the theater wing of the building, and then they also it was just kind of closed up, and it was abandoned ever since 1999.
Oh, wow. I wasn't aware of that piece. So tell me the condition of the building and what you had to work with when you started this project.
Yeah, when we came upon the project, the building was in very poor condition. The stairwells inside were crumbling, they were unsafe. A lot of the original structure of the building had been compromised. They had made openings in the floor, which compromised the structural integrity of the building. A lot of the windows were boarded up. As I said, those historic facade panels had all been covered up with metal panels, in some places with concrete panels. They took off a lot of the original brickwork. The roof was leaking. There were lots of holes in the roof. There were holes in that elevation where they had removed the theater. They didn't actually completely like fill that back in where they had removed the theater wings. It was kind of big gaping holes. There was vegetation growing on the roof and the parapet and lots of graffiti. Building was really disintegrating.
Oh, so an easy project then. So, okay, so I understand this project was a shell and core rehab. Before we get into specific areas of the work, give me a broad description of the scope of work that was included in your design.
Yeah, the rehabilitation required a seismic upgrade. We're in a seismic zone in Northern California, so earthquakes are always a big concern. Also, we did all new HVAC systems, all new, utility systems, uh, complete accessibility and code compliance, including new elevator, new exit stairs, removal of non-historic interior partitions and ceilings. Um, so really a really complete renovation inside, then full exterior rehabilitation of the historic exterior. And then we also added a fifth floor addition that included two large roof decks. And then at the ground floor, we created street front facing retail spaces with big glossy storefronts that were meant to energize the sidewalk and bring people in.
Historic buildings often have many layers of design review and approvals to even get to the point of getting a permit to do the work. Can you tell me what and then California, I say this all the time when I interview anybody on any project in California, is like working on Mars in our industry because they have a lot more stringent requirements than most states.
That's right.
What did the process look like on this project?
Yeah, so the process on this project, and this is really true really for all our historic projects, is we start with a lot of research. So really trying to understand the building, understand the history of the building, what's significant. So doing that research and analysis, really laying the groundwork for really a deep understanding of the historic building and its requirements. And then there were many meetings with City of Oakland preservation staff. This project was actually entitled as part of a larger project, which included on it had been part of the same lot as another development project, and then the lots were eventually split. But there's a large new high-rise tower. So the master plan entitlements for that tower project included the fact that this building would be renovated. So the city got to understand that they weren't going to demolish the historic building that was on the corner. So there were many meetings with the preservation staff, showing them options, especially for the addition, for the renovation of the exterior, having showing drawings that showed sight lines where you would see this new addition on top of the building when you're standing in different places, how visible it would be. Um, so it was a very collaborative process, but it was, as often is in California, it was a long process. And I think because of all the groundwork and the research we did and the design sensitivity, we won both the Partners in Preservation Award from the Oakland Heritage Alliance and a Preservation Design Award from the California Preservation Foundation.
Wow. Well, that's impressive. I'm a firm believer in being proactive. Like if you know something is going to be challenging and there's information you can put together to just hit it head on, not wait to be asked for it. But okay, here's what I know you're going to want. So here's the research, here's what we've done. And I think that things like that really smooth the process in the
Yeah, and I
long
think
run.
people are always appreciative of that work too. That like if you do it before they even ask for it, they love that. It's like, oh, you've thought about all these things. This is just what I wanted. So they're very
Well,
appreciative.
and I told you on the internet, you certainly have the background to do that effectively with all the different organizations that you're involved in,
Yeah,
which
thank
we'll
you.
talk about a little later. So, the location of a nearby BART station warranted a sensitive seismic strengthening solution. Tell me what the issue was with that and what specifically you did to solve it.
So the BART system is the Bay Area Rapid Transit System. So it's an underground subway system. And right along the building is an underground BART station as well as tunnels for that BART system. And so BART required that the structural design, we were doing this seismic retrofit. So we had to reinforce the building all the way down to the foundations. They had required that we had to show that any work that we were doing wouldn't impose any vertical or lateral loading on their tunnel or on their station. Um, and given that we were upgrading the foundations, that was a challenge to figure out how we were going to do that because it's literally, there's the edge of the building and the BART tunnel is like right below it, right below that edge of the building. So we also wanted to address their requirements without compromising the client's desire to have really open floor plates. We didn't want to have lots of structure, because of BART then forcing us to have, let's say, structure that would be closing up the sort of openness of the building. So what we and the engineering team did was create a system of the micropiles, which transfer that vertical load below the depth of the BART tunnel. And then they're connected by a series of grade beams with this 4 foot thick reinforced concrete mat slab. Um, and so that resists the building's lateral loads of the foundation level, and it's outside of the BART tunnels, what's called the zone of influence. The zone of influence is where you're imposing loads on that tunnel. And that meant that within the zone of influence, you have all these diagrams showing here's the tunnel, and it's a sort of diagonal line from your building to where the tunnel is this kind of the zone of influence. Um, our slabed grade is essentially a cantilevered slab. So it's not actually resting on the earth where we have a slabed grade. It's kind of this cantilevered from this point further back. And those micropiles extended to a 60-foot depths to avoid exerting any pressure on the subway tunnels below.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's deep. That's way down.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine what that looks like. Uh, on this podcast, we love to talk about challenges because I think that's where we learn the most in everything we do in this business. That's our business, is solving the challenges to make whatever it is we're trying to make work. Your project information mentioned that one of the most challenging parts of the rehab was reproducing missing historic features. Tell me about what you had to replicate and how you achieved that.
Yeah, so the building, it has a brick and terracotta exterior, with terracotta parapet and spandrels and a cornice. And actually, the spandrel panels were originally, historically, were sheet metal. The spandrels are the panels between the windows, between vertical window sections. So there were large sections of missing brick. Pretty much almost all of the spandrel panels were missing, and most of the cornice was missing. In addition, the building was covered with graffiti. Um, so we actually found in the building there was a place where they had disposed one of those sheet metal spandrel panels. It was pretty badly damaged, but we were able from that to take a mold so that we could recreate that panel in GFRC and glass fiber reinforced concrete. So at least we understood what that pattern looked like. So we then made the mold and then made panels, replication, GFRC panels for the spandrels. Um, and then also created, GFRC molds for the cornice because we did have a few sections where the cornice was still there. So we were able to kind of recreate, that entire very intricate, cornice that becomes the parapet of the building. Um, we also did, cleaned all the graffiti, which was cleaned by hand, and there was a lot and lot of testing of like, "Okay, let's try this product. Okay, let's try this Prosecco product to see which one actually works and how many times you have to do it and how much ghosting." There's still maybe a little bit of ghosting left, but you can't see it from the street. So, is some ghosting acceptable? Like, because at a certain point you start damaging, the brick or damaging the terracotta, so there's that balance between, okay, maybe a little ghosting is better than creating this damage in the brick. We also replaced all of the non-historic windows. The windows have been removed, so we replaced those with wood windows. Was another piece of it. So I think I've captured most of it. It was a very extensive, a lot of extensive work for the historic rehabilitation.
I'm going to go down a rabbit hole for a minute. I'm surprised I made it this long without doing that. I've always been curious when you said there was a lot of missing brick. So obviously there must have been some brick you had to replace. How do you bring in new brick with a building that old and have it work and not look like you have big sections of brand new brick against really old brick? What do you have to do to make that meld together?
Many, many, many mock-ups. I mean, that is really, really challenging. Because the brick, um, it was a mix of 6 colors. It's very difficult to replace those colors exactly. They're not a custom, it's not a standard size brick anymore, so you have to get bricks made. Um, and then, yeah, getting that mix to look right, and then you're looking at it, the mock-ups we're looking at it. I mean, this is one of the things that I think I would have wished we had done differently, was we're looking at the mock-ups in the scaffolding, like under the scaffolding has a kind of screen, like a plastic screen to protect the street and not have stuff fall off. So the light is really like you're really close to the building because you're on the scaffolding. It's only whatever 18 inches wide. There's not really good light, and you're looking at these mock-ups like you're looking at something like right up in front of your face and thinking like, oh, does this really look like the brick? You're trying to compare it to the old brick, but it's sort of you're not far enough away to really get that sense. And so that was something which we did many, many mock-ups, and we had to tweak it and tweak it and tweak it, and that was probably the most painful, dragged out part of the project. And actually, at one point, a bunch of the scaffolding came down, and then we were like, "Oh, yeah, that's not working. Okay,
Oh
I think
no. Yeah.
we're redoing this section of brick." Yeah.
It just popped in my head. It's a 1920s building. How do you replace brick in a 1920s building?
Yeah.
Well, it looks like it turned out pretty good.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we did also talk, I mean, it's possible to do brick replacement using GFRC panels. Um So, and I've done projects like that as well, where instead of actually replacing brick, you're creating GFRC that looks just like the brick, and then it's actually custom kind of painted to look like that. But then you have the worry that over time that's more likely to fade. So sometimes it's better like to do that if you have an interior application, like I worked on the San Francisco Ferry Building, where there's this huge central space that has all these arches lined with brick. In that project, we actually did replace, I mean, we restored these large sections of the building with GFRC that looks just like from brick. And it really, you cannot tell that it's not brick unless, and it's high up, so you can't like knock on it to see that it's not brick. But the problem is outside things do tend to fade more.
S- Um, so, would a historic preservation rules allow that to use those GFRC panels?
There are typically allowed, so the preference would be to use the original material, but in a condition in which the original, let's say that original feature is completely gone, like it doesn't exist anymore, then it's appropriate to use a substitute material. So it's, you have to weigh all the pros and cons, and sometimes the GFRC panels in that condition in the ferry building, it was easier to make something that looked more like the original with the GFRC than it would have been if we had done it in brick. And there was also a big concern with the weight of the brick in that, and so in that location. So sometimes it's like, actually that was GFRP, glass fiber reinforced polymer. So it was much lighter than doing it out of, real brick.
No, I'm in Oregon, so we are also in that same seismic zone.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So
yeah,
weight is a big, adding new weight can be a big issue.
yeah, weight's a big deal here.
Yeah.
Along the West Coast more so than it is in some other places.
Yeah.
So you added a penthouse to this building, which I thought was really interesting. You know, because it's an old building and you're putting this new thing on top. What was included in that, and what did you have to do to design this new construction piece to work with the aesthetic of the historic building?
Yeah. Well, we wanted the penthouse to feel, when you're in it, to really have a different feeling than the lower floors. Um, to be very open feeling. The lower floors have columns. I mean, they have pretty large windows, but still the windows are kind of, they march along the facade. And we really wanted this feeling on the penthouse that you're really like it's an indoor outdoor feeling because we have these roof decks. So it's a very, very open feeling in the penthouse. Doesn't really have interior columns because the span is a little smaller because of the roof deck has pushed the edge of the building back. Um, and we also there are amazing views of the historic Fox Theater, which is just a block away. So you have this great view of the Fox Theater, of the hills of around Oakland. So we just really wanted to have this open feeling when you're in it. However, we also wanted that when you're looking at the building from the street, that it would be kind of minimally visible and that it would be in a way you're not even that conscious that it's this addition maybe to this building. Like, oh, maybe that's a building that's further back. So we cladded in dark metal panels. So we have glass with these dark metal panels, and it is set back on both elevations from the street, from the front facade with the roof decks. So really, when you look at it from the street, you're just seeing this kind of little line of the dark uh, building, the dark addition, but it looks like, oh, maybe that's something, that's somewhere else. So it gives you a sense that it's not really, it's kind of maybe sort of floating above the building a little bit.
So that just triggered another rabbit hole. So you put this penthouse on top of the building. You put roof decks on this old building. What did you have to do for your roofing system and your structure up at the roof to back to the weight
Yeah.
accommodate that all of that going on up there?
Yeah, so we created, the top floor is actually a new, concrete floor a new concrete floor slab. So the existing floor slab at the roof wouldn't have supported this new addition. It wouldn't have supported the weight of the, roof deck. So we have the new roof decks, and we're using pedestal pavers there, um, to get a roof system that drains then. And then we've got a step in the slab as well. So the roof slab is lower and then it jumps up to the slab of the main roof or the main
Makes
interior
sense.
level. Yeah.
I was thinking they didn't put all that up there on top of an old roof. There's no
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it is an interesting question too, because one of the things that we talked a lot about with the owner is California has a historic building code, the state historic building code. And when you do a renovation of a historic building, you're able to use for the historic building, you're allowed to use lower seismic thresholds as a way to really help preserve the character of the historic building. However, once you decide, so that could be less expensive, it would be less structural work that would be involved. But once you decide to add the weight of an addition, you can no longer use that 75% of the code threshold. You have to go to 100% of the code. So that was also something where, like, is this roof deck really worth it? It's going to not only cost the roof deck cost, but it's also going to add to the cost of the structural retrofit of the building. But the client really felt that this was added a lot of value to the building.
I've been around long enough to remember when not very many places had any kind of roof deck or amenity
Yeah.
spaces on the top of buildings, and they're everywhere now. Uh, my son just moved back from Boston to the West Coast, and his apartment building had an amazing roof deck amenity space, and it is a really great way in cities to get some outdoor
Yeah.
something for for people to get outside. Even if
Yeah.
it's
I
just
think,
going out there to have lunch or whatever. And so I love them.
yeah, I think it's really connected to the sort of our focus we have now on wellness too. That is like, okay, if you're working, it's good to like get outside, take some fresh air, have a little sense of nature.
Absolutely. So there was some interior work as well in this building. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the interior work is really driven to be as efficient with what we did to create a really great space for the tenants, for the retail tenant on the ground floor and for the future office tenants on the upper floors. So the goal was really to have as much open space as possible, um, and to have the space be really efficient. So we created a new central core where we have our bathrooms and kind of service spaces, and that also allowed us to configure the shear walls that we needed in the building because we didn't want shear walls on the outside elevations or really any structural upgrading on the outside of elevations that would have impeded the views or the sense of the open windows. So we have this new core that has the C-shaped shear walls around them. And then really the goal was to clean the kind of space up enough that it has, historic character. I mean, it's an interesting thing when you're working on buildings of this period because in the 1920s, in the interior of an office building, everything would have been finished plaster with, nice plaster cornices and wood details. And now, really, what people want is this kind of raw space in which they see the original, the concrete that would not have been exposed in the 1920s and the kind of, the exposed brick. So we have the sense of kind of this very raw space that feels kind of industrial with the exposed concrete, exposed brick, concrete floors.
I worked the very first architecture firm that I worked in. I worked there for 22 years, and it was in an old 1800s building, and the interior was all brick. And while I had to dust brick dust off my desk every single day, our structural engineer used to say, if the ground starts shaking, Cherise, run. Just run. Don't stop for anything because this building's going to just fall to the ground. But it did add a different warmth and personality and feeling to the inside of the space, having that brick and everything all exposed. I would take that over plaster or chipboard or
Yeah,
anything like
yeah.
that any day of the week.
Yeah,
I
the
loved it.
textures are really nice. Yeah, the textures are
Yeah, it is.
beautiful. Yeah, the way the
Can't
light
hang
hits
anything on
the
the walls, but
right. That's right.
life gets real difficult there. What would you say, if you had to pick one, what would you say was the greatest design challenge on this project?
Yeah, and we touched a little bit about this already, but I think the exterior rehabilitation was really the most difficult part of the project because there was, even though we found that one sheet metal panel that had that we were able to replicate, there was a lot of other parts of details of the buildings that were missing that we didn't have information on. There's very sparse documentation. We had in the building department a few historic drawings that were just floor plans, but not really detailed elevation. So really figuring out how to put the building kind of back together was the most difficult part. And we spoke a lot with the client also about the ground floor because we decided at the ground floor that we weren't going to replicate the exact way that those storefronts were detailed originally in the 1920s. Um, we didn't have great documentation, we just had a few kind of blurry photographs, and B, things are, a little different. The way retail works is not the same as it was in the 1920s, so we went with a kind of more contemporary feeling, ground floor. And then, as we discussed earlier, yeah, the brick facade, really how to get those 6 different colors of brick in the exact mix. It was very, very, challenging.
Well, next time you have to do it, you're going to be a pro. I can't even imagine. So, can you tell me about one or two unique products or products you used in a unique way on this project?
Yeah, I would say the first thing that comes to mind is the replacement windows that we used, Marvin windows, and I kind of think of Marvin typically as being more doing residential windows of a smaller scale, and these are very large windows. They're kind of what's called a Chicago style window, where you've got a tripartite window configuration. They're operable windows. They've got a big, big clerestory panel. So we worked a lot with Marvin on creating a window design that really matched the sort of muntin, the thin muntins that they had originally, but they're stronger windows than those historic windows would have been. So it was really how to design a window that looked like that old window that's not like overly chunky, but is still a very large window. And they were really great to work with.
That's good to know. I often think of Marvin the same way, so I'm filing that away in my little spec writer
Yeah.
brain. There was this in the project information you sent, or maybe I found it on the internet. There was a statement that this building reinforced blight on a neglected stretch of Broadway and that this project was critical to activating the block. Tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, so this is a really important corner in the Uptown Oakland neighborhood. It's right there's the BART station is right there. It's where people come up. In neighboring blocks, there's lots of businesses and restaurants and stores, but in this block, there was really nothing happening at all. So it was kind of like the heart of the neighborhood, but it was a little bit like a missing heart. And having a building that's really boarded up, that's kind of a little spooky feeling was not really a great thing for the neighborhood. So this was really about reinforcing that sense of this being a neighborhood that's lively and vibrant, and that this is really bringing that back.
So, how did this project strengthen the historic district?
It strengthened it really by, the restoration. I mean, the building had been so badly, damaged and kind of changed over the years, it didn't even feel like it was even that historic because they had covered up so much of the facade. So you've got a lot of historic buildings right in the neighborhood, the historic Fox Theater, the historic Sears, the original the Sears building, which is now called Uptown Station. So there are all these historic buildings, and then here on this corner, there was one that felt like, "Oh, is it really a historic building? Is somebody gonna tear it down because it just looks so shabby?" So this really brings back that sense of the historic character of the 1920s.
I can only imagine. We have an area of downtown Portland that has old buildings in that kind of condition, and it would be so lovely to see those brought back. It is a game changer from
Yeah.
being that old boarded up thing to breathing life back into it. So I did a stint for 6.5 years as a spec writer in MEP engineering. So I'm always curious about that, especially in projects like this that are this old. Um, I know that there were new utility and HVAC systems that were included in this project. Um, what did that look like, and were there any specific sustainability goals for this project, or was just revamping and redoing this old building enough to be sustainable in itself?
Yeah. We are lucky that California has a very strict energy code, the California Green Code. So I think the standards of which we're building in California would be considered pretty high compared to most other states. So really starting at a very high bar just in terms of what are the minimum requirements. It's called, Title 24 and the California Green Code. What are the minimum requirements they have to do in terms of lighting systems, MEP systems, the efficiency of those systems? So we're starting with that high bar. We used a very efficient VRF system for heating and cooling, in which everything is zoned. And then we have operable windows as well. So the operable windows allow you to, on a nice day, which the Bay Area has really good climate, so you can open the windows and get fresh air in the building as well.
I love construction stories. I absolutely love construction stories. And you look at a building like this, and we could probably do 5 episodes probably on construction stories. So I can only imagine what the construction phase looked like on this project. I feel like as design professionals, some of our biggest lessons learned often come when we are watching our designs get built. Did that really work the way we thought it would?
Mm.
Or was that more challenging? Things like that. Tell me about one or two unexpected challenges that you faced during the construction phase and what your team did to solve those.
Mm. Well, the first one I would say is the flood. So it wasn't rain that caused the flood, but a water main broke in the street, and water just came flooding into the building. And it was maybe it was like a week or 2 weeks after we had just installed all the elevator machine equipment, um, in the basement elevator machine room, and the whole basement was, completely flooded with water, so all of those systems had to be replaced, and you have to deal with, cleaning up that building, getting the water out, and then addressing all the things that the water damage creates. And then obviously when it's a flood that's caused by some outside factor like this, it's like the owner's like, oh, we've got to now work with the city and with insurance and with the water company. So, and how not to, it's going to delay the project, but how can we work with the owner to really minimize any delays? And what can we do as quickly as possible to replace those systems, to figure out what needs to be replaced, what can stay, how can we order things in a fast track way? So that was probably the first one, not the first, but one of the biggest kind of surprises is getting that call like, oh, the building is completely flooded. It's like it's not even raining yet.
Oh, well, in dealing with all of the people that you mentioned, insurance and the city and all
Yeah.
of those things, none of that ever moves quickly, no
Yeah.
matter how hard you work at it. So, did it end up delaying the project
It did delay it, but
significantly?
not luckily, the contractor was very savvy about how to figure out, how to replace things, and we kind of reworked the schedule, so it wasn't a significant delay, but it definitely did delay the project. Yeah. And then another challenge was the city. While we were doing the project, the city was installing a new express bus system, which includes these kind of, elevated bus stations, and there's one right in the area outside of where the sidewalk in front of our building. So they were replacing all the sidewalk, but it was very difficult to get them to tell us what the grades were going to be in all this new sidewalk. So it's like we didn't really have a survey, and the building in the interior had a lot of different levels, and we have multiple entries for the main lobby and for the corner retail and for the exit and for the parking garage, but we didn't really have a sidewalk that, they ripped up the sidewalk, but it took a long time before they put it back. And it's like, and then when they did, they were like, oh, well, we ended up with slightly different grades than we thought we were going to have when we came out and surveying it. So it's like how to deal with all these entrance conditions and getting the slopes right. And as you know, with accessibility, you can only have 2% cross slope. So and you have to have level landings everywhere, and you've got all these different entrances, and everything is kind of slightly off or slightly different than you expected. So there was a lot of work really trying to figure out how to get the entrances to work with this interfacing with this other project that was happening at the same time.
That sounds like fun. That was sarcasm. What would you say your biggest lesson learned was from this project that will make you an even better architect on the next project?
Yeah, I would say doing lots of mock-ups, and we talk about this, think about the condition and the location of those mock-ups. Like, where do you really need to see the mock-ups from? And I think having the mock-ups, on the scaffolding that was so narrow where you're too close to the building wasn't really ideal. And then we were sometimes you get rushed into making decisions. There's a lot of pressure with the schedule. It's like, oh, you need to decide, you need to decide. So you feel this obligation sometimes to say, like, oh, okay, I think that's good enough, but maybe you're making the decision based on not enough information. So to always think about the big picture rather than getting caught up in the schedule of like what's happening to you at the moment.
You just talking about that triggered another question. I'm assuming this building is in the middle of an urban area. What did staging look like for construction? I'm assuming some of those mock-ups were where they were because there wasn't, you don't have a big, huge empty
That's right.
site to put a bunch of
That's
things.
right.
So
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it's hard. I think, I mean, this is the thing about like, what would you do differently? And I think it's about how you describe in your specifications the conditions of the mock-up so the contractor can know what you really want. So maybe we should have said, like, we're going to make these mock-ups and there will be a section where you maybe have to remove the scaffolding for a period of time so we can see them against the building. Describing in more detail in your specifications and drawings what you need for mock-ups, because I feel so often we just say, "Oh, we want a mock-up of this," or "We want a mock-up of that," but we don't completely describe the intent of the mock-up, how we need to see the mock-up, how long the mock-up will be there, how much time we have after the mock-up, to decide whether that's right or not. There's a whole period, this whole piece about the mock-ups that I think needs to be thought through and integrated.
that I write those mock-up specs all the time. And
Yeah,
I'm sitting here and I am soaking this in right now because that is fantastic advice. And I don't think I've ever really thought about it from that aspect
yeah.
before of, you get it, but how you're going to view it. And I've had that come up in a couple of interviews, most particularly with brick, where somebody was using some coating on a brick and they get the coating on the brick and wait, that did not look the way we wanted it to. Or didn't age the way we wanted it to, or different things. But I never really thought about in your specifications talking about, not just that we need this mock-up, but where is that going to go and why do we need to look at it in a certain way? And that's important. So
Yeah.
you just taught me something today. Thank
Oh,
you very
great.
much. Before we get to our two closing questions, tell me what it is. TEF Design, correct?
Yes, absolutely
Okay,
right.
not
Yep.
not TEF. I did just
TF.
Yeah,
Yep.
I don't want to get that wrong. Tell me what TEF Design has underway that we can look forward to hearing about in the future.
That's a fantastic question because we've got a lot of really, really exciting projects underway, and we could spend a whole podcast just running through them, but I'll just talk about a few. Um, so we've got a broad range of projects for the University of California for three different campuses underway that are really, really exciting. And one is at UC Santa Cruz. We're doing a renewal of historic Kresge College, which was designed by Charles Moore in the 1960s and 70s. And we've been collaborating with the Chicago Architects Studio Gang. And the first phase was finished last year, which was a series of new buildings, dormitories, classroom buildings. Um, and the next phase is under construction, and that in our collaboration with Studio Gang, they had primary responsibility on the new buildings, and we have had primary responsibility on the rehabilitation and renewal of kind of the original part of the campus. So that's a series of buildings that we're reconstructing some and renovating others. So it's a very, very large project under construction right now. Another one is at the University of California in San Diego. We're doing the renovation and expansion of the Shiley Eye Institute. It's also a very exciting project. And then another UC California project is at the University of California at Berkeley. We're doing a new facility that will house the Wertheim School of Optometry and Vision Science.
Busy. Well,
Yeah,
I will hope that you will call me when they're done and say, "Hey,
yeah,
Cherise, can we come back and chat about this?"
yeah.
So our two
Well, I
closing
think for
questions. Oh, go
I
ahead.
would say that Kresge College one could be because that project is a very, very complex, incredibly interesting project. We could do a multi-phase podcast on that one.
Well, and we are fans of having more than one guest. Typically,
Yeah,
not more than two, but maybe we could get you and somebody from Studio Gang in
yeah.
and do a little two-part series or a hand-in-hand episodes, or just both of you together talking about the projects. That would be great.
Yeah,
I would love that. So
yeah.
our two closing questions, there's always a more broad industry question. So according to your bio on your website, you have a passion and expertise around preservation, renewal, and waterfront development, as evidenced by the lengthy list of historic preservation groups that you're involved in. I've worked on a few historic buildings in the past, and those are some of the hardest projects to do. They really are. There's just so many surprises and so many challenges. What golden gems of advice would you give to another architect or a young architect who was about to embark on or is considering embarking on their first historic project?
Well, that's a great question. It's one I think about all the time. And I would say where I would start is really letting the building or the site, this historic building that you're going to be working on, kind of let it tell you what it wants to be. So don't go in there feeling like, oh, I need to make my mark and I'm going to do these things and come in with some preconceived notion of like what you're going to do. I think really kind of spend time kind of soaking up that character of the building, its kind of shape, its kind of size, its original features, so that when you're doing the project, you're not trying to squeeze something that doesn't fit into it. If you're working on a building that's a beautiful open space, don't suddenly say like, "Oh, I need to divide that into like all these little rooms or something," because that's really not what the building wants to be. So it's really about listening, getting as many lessons as you can from the building, understanding the original architect's intentions, like what they're really trying and striving for, and think about, yeah, what are the best features here that you can really promote and really kind of make, renew and make bring back again.
It isn't, to me, isn't that, and I'm not an architect, don't pretend to be one, but isn't that the mark of a really good architect? When you're designing a new building, that's where you get to be creative and take your visions into it. But
Mm.
when you're taking a historic building, it already has its own personality.
Yeah.
And being able to come in and, like you said, listen to the building, feel the building, and how can I make that the best it can be instead of how can I make my mark. It's a little bit of setting some ego to the side and being humble and bowing down to the building a little bit.
Yeah, and it still requires tremendous creativity. I think people often think like, "Oh, it's not gonna be creative." No, you have to be even, maybe even more creative by doing that. Trying to figure out how what you're gonna do and introduce is gonna really work with that building in a really seamless and beautiful way.
The life lessons and career lessons of working on a historic building are invaluable. In it's just a different path. Every step of the way in an old building is a different path. I love that. I love that answer. Final question, the easiest question of the day. Everybody gets this one. We all hope to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution to make the world a better place. I know I do, personal or professional. What do you hope your impact will be?
Yeah, that's a really beautiful question, and thank you for asking that.
Thank you.
I have always felt that I'd love to have the impact of creating places that really bring people together, that are kind of about community and connection and creating environments in our cities that are livable and human-centered and walkable and that have a sense of kind of texture, like bringing those historic buildings back so that there's a sense of the texture and the history of a place, so that you're really living in a place that's has all these layers that gives you a sense of kind of richness of the fabric. It's a place that you feel welcomed at home, place to meet your friends and, gather and do all kinds of things. So for me, it's really that's what I found so rewarding about working on these historic projects, that sense of really creating places that just feel so welcoming and so kind of socially invigorating.
Sounds like describing some of the best people I know as well.
Yeah.
Multifaceted and interesting
Right.
and absolutely. Andrew, this conversation has been literally an absolute delight. Thank you so much for joining me on Detail today, and I hope you'll come back.
Thank you, Cherise. I will be delighted to come back. It's been a really fun talking to you today.
Thank you.